An interesting thought experiment. On 4chan, somebody posted pretending to be a billionaire that they had introduced some kind of longevity protein into some public water supplies and that they were now forcibly extending the lifespan of people. Will we one day run into that kind of insane situation? And what do you think that will do to us psychologically?
Well, I mean, we put fluoride in the water. I mean, if things are, very well established to be good for everybody, then, kind of why not?
If we did have an artificial superintelligence that surpassed not only any individual's capability, but the collective capability of a nation, would you ever feel comfortable voting for that kind of machine as a representative in government?
Yeah, so that really is considerably above my pay grade.
Aubrey, thank you again so much for joining me this morning as the person who I believe popularized the idea of longevity escape velocity initially, a topic which is rapidly taking over the entire globe from what I can see. How do you feel at this point, September 4th, 2025, about how that process is developing? What is developing as you expected? What's unexpected? Yeah, general take.
Well, yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's very, very great privilege. So, I mean, for someone in my position, leading a global crusade of such magnitude and importance, it's always double-edged. On the one hand, I feel very happy that things are accelerating and that, progress is being made and people actually understand what longevity escape velocity is. 20 years ago when I coined that term, it was a hard sell. But on the other hand, I always wish it were going faster, and I know that it could be going faster if more people, especially more people who have power and money and so on, were behind it.
Yeah, that is a perennial crux, the funding not being allocated to the most prosperous endeavors. It breaks my heart to hear that that is still such a contentious issue for you. I did hear you speak recently on a podcast regarding another founder's attempt to tokenize specific scientific ideas.
We are going after, more of something that looks like meme coins, which is meme coin tokenomics. That's much, much more speculative, frankly. And, kind of tying the value of the compound to the token directly. So basically one token, one compound.
Things which the public might be able to buy into via a tokenized effort. Y'all had also talked about tokenizing yourselves personally as scientists, especially everything that happened with the Trump coin. That seems like a very interesting avenue for not only collecting interest, but collecting funds. Are you looking into anything like that for you and your work personally?
Absolutely, we are, yes. So the crypto community, the blockchain community have been big supporters of this work, especially of my work, really since crypto began almost, certainly since, let's say, 2016, 2017. Vitalik Buterin, who created Ethereum, of course, read my book when he was 14, when it came out, and he was hooked immediately, and he started supporting our work financially pretty much as soon as he was in a position to do so. He's been a very major donor over the years, and we're enormously grateful. But yeah, many other people in the crypto community have got heavily involved over recent years. Brian Armstrong, the creator of Coinbase, created a company called New Limit, which is working on partial reprogramming, things like that. So yes, we've had a lot of support. And you're quite right, tokenizing our work is a very promising approach. Now, I myself am pretty ignorant about that whole world, but because I've got so many supporters who are very knowledgeable about it, we've been able to make it happen. And just last week, in fact, a coin called Aubrey, Aubrai, was launched, and it's doing quite well. You can totally go and buy it, and if you do, then we make money out of it. We are, of course, being very cautious about divesting those coins ourselves. We have a certain proportion of the supply. Because we don't want the price to go down, but we also get a good slice of the transaction fees. So all in all, this is very promising as a way to, to leverage and dovetail with such a popular movement.
Yeah, that is awesome. And I wish you all the best of luck in those endeavors. One of the other things I've heard you talking about was this idea of anticipating the anticipation, that has
Mhm.
been a key focus of your work, that you want people to get ready, not just for the prospect of longevity escape velocity, but for what that is going to do to our global psyche. I saw a meme going around the internet. I take it as entirely fictitious, but it is an interesting thought experiment. On 4chan, somebody posted pretending to be a billionaire that they had introduced some kind of longevity protein, molecule, peptide, whatever, into some public water supplies, and that they were now forcibly extending the lifespan of people. As we get closer to Lev, it seems like those situations become maybe not plausible, but at least within the realm of conception. Do you think that we are at all prepared? Has the global community adapted that? Or will we one day run into that kind of insane situation? And what do you think that will do to us psychologically?
So first of all, don't call it Lev, call it LEV.
Excuse
Um,
me.
however, well, I mean, we put fluoride in the water. I mean, if things are, very well established to be good for everybody, then, kind of why not? However, I will say that the treatments that are going to be required to bring aging under medical control will definitely include things that can't just be put in the water or even supplied in pill form or anything like that. They will have to be injected because they will involve cell therapies and gene therapies, which have to go directly into the circulation rather than going through the gut. Um, and now, I mean, once the world gets its head around the idea that aging is actually not just a bad thing, but a bad thing that we can do something about, then yeah, all hell will break loose. So you mentioned my phrase, anticipate the anticipation. I should perhaps unpack that a little bit.
Please.
So I believe right now that we have a 50-50 chance of reaching longevity escape velocity within the next 12 to 15 years, so by the end of the 2030s. And a lot of people think that's an insanely optimistic time frame. But the reason I say that is because the main reasons why people think it's over optimistic are not scientific reasons. They are regulatory and societal reasons. It takes, a lot more than 12 to 15 years to get just one drug through the FDA, quite typically. So people will look at that as a comparator. But I say that what we should really use as a comparator is COVID, because when 5 years ago, COVID happened, people were generally not in favor of it and they wanted it to stop. And so, you know, governments who wanted to get, re-elected, they acted accordingly. And every single thing we thought we knew about, institutional bureaucracy and regulatory inertia and so on, just was swept aside overnight, with the result that we had vaccines that were developed and globally distributed in less than a year, which is literally 10 times faster than had ever happened in the history of humanity before then. So, that's the kind of reason that I take into account. And where that comes back to anticipating the anticipation is that the sequence of events that I see happening will be that in the next few years, could be as little as 3 or 4 years, we will make such big breakthroughs in the laboratory in mice, in terms of postponing aging, that it will become impossible to deny that aging is potentially treatable with medicine. And in particular, it will become, if you like, safe to become emotionally invested in it, to actually think, this might be in time for me, and so on. So it's going to be another 10 years after that before we actually get these medicines really working in human beings rather than just mice. But during those 10 years, it's going to be like 2020 all over again, where there isn't any medicine, right? But we know it's coming and we know that we want to try as hard as possible. And a huge part of that is the ways in which people will look at their personal finances. If you think about what people spend most of their money on, it essentially revolves mostly around things that relate to how long they expect to live.
Hmm.
What kind of health insurance premium you want to pay, or life insurance premium, or your inheritance arrangements, or or pensions. All of these things. Even how much you invest in your kids' education. These things are all related to expected lifespan. So 5 years from now, supposing we've made these breakthroughs in the lab that have caused this sea change in public perception of the plausibility of bringing aging under medical control in the foreseeable future, supposing we get there, then everyone's going to switch pretty much overnight from an expectation that they will live only a few years longer than their parents did to an expectation that they're going to live dramatically longer. And that's going to change the numbers for the things I just mentioned. So it's going to completely upend the global economy. And the only way to minimize the turbulence that will arise at that point is to anticipate it. For governments and pension funds and insurance companies and so on to be ready for this to happen, not to know when it's going to happen precisely, because of course it's research, we can't know precisely, but to be ready for it when it does happen, to roll out a whole new type of product and so on. And so whenever I get the chance to give talks to pension funds or whatever, this is what I tell them. And unfortunately, they're not really listening yet. They're terribly courteous at the time, but I have this terrible feeling of foreboding that, they'll go away and the following morning they'll wake up and it was all a bad dream and they will get on and do what they were doing anyway.
That's funny and tragic. We
Right.
have seen longevity come up in some recent international conversations. I'm not sure if you saw the clip of Xi Jinping speaking to Vladimir Putin about the
I did,
potential of
I did an interview with Politico literally 1 hour ago about exactly
yeah.
that. Yeah.
I mean, how much longer do you think can the pension funds bury their heads in the sand when world leaders are now talking with that kind of expectation? Do you think it is ego? Is it something else that needs to be overcome for them? Is the robust mouse rejuvenation the best shot at clarifying that boundary for them?
I think it is. I think
Yeah.
that one's going to need people to be voting with their feet. But these companies and these and governments need to be ready before then, so that they can react nimbly when the whole thing actually happens. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's not exactly that they have their heads in the sand just like gratuitously. If you think about the mechanics of these companies, and indeed governments, they've taken huge bets already on continuation of past trends in life expectancy and health expectancy. They have taken bets, in other words, against the prospect that some dramatic step change will happen. And that means that they are kind of, in the near term, terribly heavily invested in not embracing the possibility of dramatic change. But I say, fuck that. I say you should be simply looking, spending 0.1% of your budget on having teams that generate, a future business strategy, on the assumption that these changes will happen. It doesn't take much money, and if you don't do it, you're going to go bankrupt.
Amen. It's fascinating to see so many different technologies, so many different sci-fi sounding concepts coming to the fore all at once. LEV
Right.
is one of them. We also have the rise of artificial intelligence. It's fascinating to see how those two are interconnecting. One of the ways it seems they touch is through simulation. And I know the expense of your research is gratuitous just based on the necessities of it at times, not in the larger sense, but just in the amount of effort it takes you to get that. Is there any way that you've seen simulation as potentially benefiting your work? Might that speed up the time frame you're anticipating?
Oh, for sure. But I don't quite look at it that way. I have kind of priced that in already, in the sense that I always look in terms of when I'm trying to estimate timeframes, I always look at obviously where we need to get to, where we are now, how rapidly we're moving forward, and extrapolate from there. But I also take into account the unknown unknowns, the frequency with which just out of the blue some new thing happens that provides an enormous shortcut. So, CRISPR was an example of that, the ability to edit genes, in cell culture and also in vivo in a way that we could never do before. The IPS, induced pluripotent stem cells, 6 or so years earlier was another one. The sequencing of the human genome 25 years ago was definitely another one. And so, the rise of artificial intelligence over the past decade and its application to biomedical challenges, certainly that's another one. AlphaFold is, of course, a very conspicuous example of a program that, people were trying to create for decades previously with no success whatsoever, and bang, here we are. So yeah, I kind of price in the frequency of miracles, if you like. The fact that miracles happen at a certain established frequency. You don't know what the miracle is going to be, you just know it's going to be big. And if we look at AI more generally, you mentioned specifically simulations. Absolutely, there's plenty that can be done there. Molecular modeling of how a particular, enzymatic reaction or whatever is going to happen is a very key part of drug design. And AI can make it work faster and better, just by essentially streamlining the software that does this so that it doesn't have to look at every atom in detail. It can kind of work out what's going to happen and take big steps. It certainly applies across drug design in other ways as well, not just simulation. So yeah, absolutely. AI is a big deal right now in terms of biomedical research.
Are y'all looking at any tangible measures to incorporate simulation into your research?
Well, remember, LEV Foundation has a rather narrow focus. We are just one part of this ecosystem. So if I answer that question with the word we, meaning the whole community, then absolutely, yes, certainly there's a lot of that going on, including in companies that have spun out from my previous organizations. But LEV Foundation is focused on one thing at the moment, which is combining interventions in mice that other people have already shown to have promise in terms of extending their lives. This is something that is not sexy to most people. It doesn't create new intellectual property to speak of. It doesn't test, mechanistic hypotheses of anything. So it doesn't get you high profile papers, which is what academics live for. So it's not aligned with the incentive structure of most other organizations or people. And that means it falls to me to, to persuade people to write me big checks so that I can do these very large experiments with 1,000 mice or 2,000 mice that will, I believe, quite soon be able to really change the game entirely with regard to the malleability of aging.
God bless. I wish you all the best of success with that. Understandably, unsexy but incredibly necessary work. In terms of paradigm shifts, again, going back to the artificial intelligence question, my own mission is aligned somewhat in the same direction. I'm trying to get people to picture what rapid advances in that technology might mean for our systems of governance. For example, what would it mean if we did have an artificial superintelligence that surpassed not only any individual's capability, but the collective capability of a nation, perhaps the entire human race? If we do reach that point at some time in the future, would you ever feel comfortable voting for that kind of machine as a representative in government? ASI for President 2028 is a catchy tagline, but at any point in the future, could you see yourself
Yeah, so
participating
that
in that?
really is considerably above my pay grade. The
God bless.
the whole way in which artificial intelligence will take over society is still completely unclear. Of course, people, including good friends of mine, have been nervous about this going, pear-shaped for a long time. If AI starts to be too autonomous and not to be aligned with what we want it to do. I still don't know whether that is a reasonable fear. I have good friends on both sides of that debate, people who think that we are pretty much certain to die within the next decade because of AI getting out of control, and people who think that the whole thing is complete nonsense and we will never have that problem. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, really, all machines are there to make us more productive. This includes computers and machines with computers inside them. And the more autonomous those machines are, the more work they save us up to a point. But we need to also be aware of the trade-off that the more autonomous we make them, the more they may misunderstand what we want them to do. So that's really all.
All right, I'm going to take that as a no, but perhaps a soft no, depending on the capabilities of the machines. I appreciate it is seemingly impossible for a lot of people possibility. But
Mhm.
another thing I wanted to go back to, and I know you have addressed this extensively for the past 20 years, but it is something that gets repeatedly brought up, especially since it was supposed dictators, Xi Jinping and Putin, who did bring up the potential of LEV in their conversation. A lot of people are still nervous about that. You've presented many great arguments why that is not an issue. But one of the things that I don't know if you've addressed is this idea of game theory in general and how it starts to change our relationship dynamics once we do have the potential of radically extending our lives. It seems to me like the possibility of a supremely enhanced lifespan decreases your payoff from backstabbing, taking out, being a dictator in a general society framing. Have you considered the problem from that lens, or what do you think about it at first gloss?
Yeah, it's hard to say whether it decreases or increases the payoff. I mean, of course, the reason why it's hard to say is because we're not really talking about the payoff. We're talking about the perceived payoff. We're talking about how people view their future in relation to the actions that they may take today. So, for example, a basic thing is like risk aversion. You know, people will think, well, okay, I'm probably not going to just recreationally jump out of planes with a parachute because the parachute might fail and I would be risking more life if I did that. Um, I mean, when I was on Colbert many years ago, probably 17 years ago, he said this. He said, people are going to be scared to cross the street. And my response was that, well, it's going to be fine because your grandmother can help you across the street because she's still going to be healthy. Um, but
It's a good response.
But yeah, I mean, it's that kind of logic that one has to take into account. If one's thinking one's probably going to be able to live in a healthy state for a very, very long time, one is going to make different decisions, but those decisions are going to be, very personal. For example, some people care about money, and so they're just going to want to carry on making more money, and they're never going to get bored of that. But maybe they will get bored of it. Kids is another thing. People often, and one of the other things that people constantly complain about is, oh dear, where will we put all the people if people stop dying? Which is nonsense for a whole bunch of reasons. But one thing that we absolutely do not know is whether kids are just going to go out of fashion. In general, the statement that I like to make is that it's a waste of time to make any speculations about the distant future, because those speculations will be completely dependent on the validity of those speculations will be completely dependent on things that we can no way imagine, technological advances that we, not only do we not know when they're going to happen, we haven't even thought that they could. We haven't even thought of them, right? Like the internet. I mean, come on. And so, beyond simply the fact that nobody is ever going to want to get sick, however long ago they were born, I just work on the basis of, just work from that. That's all you need to know, all you need to assume in order to take aging seriously and try to fix it.
I appreciate the practicality. Another big conversation happening right now is around the birth rate crisis. You mentioned kids. There seems to be a global recognition that if we can't reproduce, we are in some ways doomed as a species already. Do you see LEV as an escape from that crisis as well? Have you pitched it from that perspective?
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, the problem of a rising age in the population is only a problem because old people tend to be declining in function. If you've got a large proportion of the population that is chronologically old, but essentially nobody who's biologically old, then you don't have a problem. And as you say, if people are not dying, then it's okay. It becomes less of a problem that people are not being born very often. I am still completely dumbfounded by the the prognostications of Elon Musk in this regard, where he seems to be against the idea of doing anything about aging, but yes, he's very strong on the population collapse problem. Um, you know, and one day I'll be able to slap him around and go into. But the fact is, yeah, I mean, when I say I'm surprised, it's only because Elon Musk is a very smart guy. Uh, the fact is, most people are very irrational and illogical about this kind of question.
Yeah. On the point of rationality, what has the reception been more recently, especially with the religious community? I'm a religious believer myself, and I think the possibility of escape velocity is so fascinating and how it connects to various religious beliefs across the world. But
Hmm.
I imagine you still get a lot of pushback there. Have you seen that softening?
So actually, we don't really get very much pushback. I mean, of
That's
course,
great to
some
hear.
people will just say, death gives meaning to life, and it's playing God to try to make us live a lot longer. But that line of thought doesn't go very far. Even people who really don't want to think about this, realize pretty quickly that the whole thing doesn't make sense. When one starts from the fact that we don't work on longevity, we work on health. This is all about keeping people healthy, and the longevity is merely a side effect. Then this all goes away because, number one, declining health causes suffering, and every religion says that we're supposed to be acting to minimize other people's suffering, right? So that means that, it would be a sin not to work on bringing aging under control.
Amen.
But also, I mean, last I checked, according to most religions, God is supposed to be omnipotent, which means he can perfectly well strike you down with a thunderbolt, however healthy you are. And therefore, again, there's no way that this is, challenging God's plan for us or anything like that. In fact, just the opposite. The fact is, we were, the way we are is we are naturally inclined to try to improve our condition, whether it's our quality of life or our quantity of life. And therefore, saying, oh, no, we're just going to leave this one alone, that would be unnatural. And that would be challenging God's plan for us, because it would be ignoring the desires and abilities that God has given us.
I love that perspective. I think it shows a lot more faith than in some believers I encountered. I'll definitely remember those points for those conversations. You also mentioned the fear of dying, perhaps being more of a concern for some people. We've seen Brian Johnson's Don't Die movement seemingly popularizing this same point. One of the potential pitfalls I see of that movement is as these uh, health increasing factors become more and more available, presumably they're going to become available to the richest among us first. And that might cause even a greater level of societal mistrust, societal class consciousness, class antagonism, class warfare, perhaps, if we don't see those technologies broadly rolled out. Do you have that concern?
Not at all. So, I mean, this is a very important point, and it comes back to the thing we were talking about earlier with regard to anticipating anticipation. Fact is, there will be 10 years. No way could it be less than 5 years. I would say 10 years between the point where aging really does become the new COVID, where we are really taking aging seriously, and the point where we actually have these treatments available to anybody, right? So in those 10 years, what's going to happen? Even if nobody listens to me and people like me until we get that breakthrough in the lab, but then suddenly everyone is going full tilt to try to defeat aging. During those 10 years, governments can do stuff. And the thing that's going to dominate their thinking is not so much the humanitarian imperative to make sure everyone gets these things, or even the electoral imperative, which will be very clear because no one's going to have a manifesto commitment that says, yeah, we're going to only make these things available to the rich. But there's a much more fundamental thing, which is the sheer mercenary economic imperative. Fact is, today, when we don't have these medicines, most of the medical budget of the Western world goes on the health problems of late life. And all that money will be saved if we give people preventative medicine to stop them from getting sick when they're getting old. Now, of course, not all of it will be saved because that medicine will cost something. And initially, like any new technology, it'll probably cost quite a lot. But it will still pay for itself massively many times over really quickly, just because we will save the money that we would otherwise be spending keeping sick people alive. So that means that governments will simply, throw the money at the problem. They will front load the investment that's required to build the infrastructure and train the personnel and everything so as to ensure that everybody who is old enough to need these treatments can get them, irrespective of ability to pay. Now, this is a line of thinking that sometimes seems a little, alien to, especially to the US audience, where, medicine is paid for by insurance and all that. But honestly, it doesn't matter. The fact is, it's uh, it's there's no contest. There's no way that any country, whatever their predilections for healthcare or predilections for taxes or whatever, will be able to survive without taking the decision to keep their population healthy.
I agree. The tide is definitely in that favor strongly, especially in the long term. In the short term, I would worry maybe more poignantly about the current players using their entrenched position when they do have drugs that are meant to treat illnesses. If
Okay.
we are now preventing those illnesses, that seems like it could run
Yeah,
afoul of
so this
their
this is
cause.
this is definitely something that comes up a lot. People say, "Well, big pharma, the medical industry is not going to like any of this. They want to, they make their money out of keeping sick people alive, not out of stopping people from getting sick." But the reason they make their money that way fundamentally comes down to the attitudes of the public.
Hmm.
It's not as if one needs different technology to develop preventative medicine than what one needs to develop curative or treatment medicine. So once the public takes a different attitude to what medicine they want, the medical industry will simply follow the money. Of course, that's another thing that requires anticipating anticipation in order not to have a bunch of turbulence, because governments have to, readjust the incentive structures and the regulatory structures and so on, so as to make sure that the medical industry can actually get the money from developing things that are preventative that the public want. But at the moment, the problem is the public doesn't really want preventative medicine. Preventative medicine has always been an insanely hard sell because most people are just appallingly bad at reasoning about uncertainty. They will say, well, okay, there's this medicine, and they claim it's preventative, and there's lots of, data from clinical trials saying that it delays the onset of this or that chronic disease of late life. But this is a new medicine. It's experimental. There is some chance that it will actually make me sick rather than delaying the point at which I get sick. And at that point, they will switch off their brains. They will completely fail to take into account the fact that the data already available shows that the chance of making somebody sick is infinitesimal, whereas the chance of delaying the time which they get sick is large. And therefore, they will not try to get these medicines. It's crazy, but it's the norm, and that's why governments don't make it easy for preventative medicines to be developed and approved, and that's why the industry doesn't develop them.
I maybe maybe I place, and you're the expert in this realm, so I defer to your statement there completely. But I think part of that entrenched belief within people, part of their reticence, what looks like anti-reason, is that they do have so much mistrust in the greater system that has grown up around these things with the
Mhm.
millions, if not billions of dollars spent on lobbying and that kind of thing. I
Mhm.
definitely agree 100% though that transparency of data and putting the information in front of people is the cure all to that.
No, it's not. It definitely isn't. The
What do
point
you
is
think is, yeah,
people don't pay attention to the data. They only pay attention to their gut feeling. Now,
that's interesting.
trust would be nice, but you don't really need trust for this. I don't have to trust Larry Page and Sergey Brin in order to use Google Chrome. It's like,
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. I'm particular. I don't know. The Google point is interesting because I'm using them less and less because of the trust implicit in there. But one of the other trends that's happening right now is the democratization of expertise through artificial intelligence, right? It's so fascinating to see people get equivalent or sometimes even better diagnosis from a $20 a month subscription they're paying to an LLM than from the doctor that is charging them an order of magnitude more than that. Do you see, or how do you see that kind of interplaying with the ability to self-treat with some of these pending treatments that you and
Yeah.
others are developing?
So this is a shift, a sea change that began way before AI. Basically, it was driven by the internet. The more that it was possible to do one's own research
Yeah.
online, the more the doctor-patient relationship shifted to being a kind of a relationship of equals rather than a relationship of, master-slave, if you like. Now, for sure, AI has taken that to the next level. But of course, the question of self-treatment revolves not only around determining what treatment you want, but also on the ability to actually access such treatments.
Hmm.
And, in pretty much the whole world, access is limited by regulatory, let's say, risk aversion, really. Um, Now, of course, that is to some extent changing. In the US, there is quite a lot going on under the banner of right to try,
Yeah.
where certain states, at the moment, it's really only happening in Montana and in New Hampshire, are passing legislation to make it easier to get hold of drugs that have not completed the approval process. In New Hampshire, it's basically um, you can get whatever you like, however, even if it hasn't been shown to be safe, let alone effective. But you can only get it if you're terminally ill. In other words, if you have already gone exhausted the options that are approved. In Montana, the situation is a bit different. You can get something preventative. You can get something however healthy you are, but it has to have already gone through what's called phase 1 of clinical trials. So it has to already have been shown to be safe, even though not necessarily effective. And but both of these approaches have enormous merit. They really change the game. And of course, there is a huge push right now for other states and perhaps the federal government to follow suit. And similarly, in the rest of the world, there are other jurisdictions that have been set up as special economic zones within certain countries doing the same kind of thing. So, progress is being made, but it's too slow.
Prospera, I think, is one of those that I've heard of. I can't remember the exact location of it. Somewhere
Yeah,
in South America,
Prosper.
I believe.
Prosper is probably the
Yeah.
major one. It's on Roatan, which is an island off the coast of Honduras, and it's a small place. They've only got one or two clinics, but they have an increasing number of companies incorporating there and taking advantage of the autonomy that exists. Um, it's there's a pretty good prospect that it will become a real global hub of medical tourism. But there, of course, you do have the problem that the access is limited by ability to pay. You've got to get there. You've got to have the wherewithal to actually do things without insurance or anything. And so the hope is that places like that will generate, FOMO and cause established jurisdictions to modernize their regulatory practices at a more rapid rate than is happening otherwise.
It's also an interesting answer to the question of if the rich are getting unfair access to these treatments early. They're also the guinea pigs in a lot of these cases as well. So maybe that's
Oh yeah,
the trade-off they're making.
oh
Um,
yeah, that's certainly true.
on the topic of potential life extension, I heard Peter Diamandis, who is the founder of the X Prize in many different categories. I think he's contributed to longevity research there as well. Speak without naming them exactly about a European company that is, if I understood him correctly, uh, producing headless clones for organ transplant. In the US, we've seen a lot of the potential breakthrough medical treatments run into seeming moral walls. I think of Christopher Reeves and the stem cell debate in the 80s, 90s, 2000s that seemed to slow down a lot of progress there to my mind. I'm not sure what your more informed take on that is, but do you think there will be more moral considerations, or how should we approach those kind of issues that are going to touch people off ethically?
Yeah, it's tricky. And I will say, Peter plays an enormously important role in that whole debate, or debates of that nature, because he is probably the world's best person in terms of combining technological vision, whether it's medical or otherwise,
Yeah.
with salesmanship. He understands how to sell really ambitious ideas. And I feel very happy that he and I have been close friends for a long, long time.
Nice.
We started talking about doing an X Prize for Aging maybe 15 years ago. took a long time to come to fruition, but it's there now. I'm very proud of that. I'm obviously still very closely involved as an advisor on the prize. But yeah, I mean, the sky's the limit on this. The idea of headless clones, as you say, is something that's been around as a concept for a long time. And it's definitely, the tools are available to do that. I am certainly not aware of any European company doing this. However, I do know that quite a lot of people are exploring the concept. And of course, the idea is that if you were to be able to, safely and effectively attach an old head to a young body that was grown in the lab, then the old head would be very profoundly rejuvenated. We don't even know whether that's true yet. People are definitely working on the surgery that would be required in dogs, for example, to see whether that actually works. But it's very, very tricky surgery. You've got to connect a lot of things. And so, that's still got a little way to go. But, is it an ethical problem? I mean, people had ethical issues around organ transplants decades ago until people tried it and it worked, and people said, I don't fancy dying because my liver has failed when I had the option not to. And the ethical problems just went away, because people saw that it was fine. Same with in vitro fertilization, of course. And there were various people grumbling about it for a little while, but only a little while. I think, the main problems around the idea of headless clones are actually more technological. The fact that it takes a long time to grow one, and you've really got to grow, at this point anyway, you have to grow them from, cells taken from the person who's going to get them, because otherwise you have an immune reaction. Now, in principle, we might be able to find really good ways around that. And if we could, you could have whole banks of headless clones waiting to be used. But that's quite a long way off.
Do you pay any consideration to I know some of these treatments and even the more outlandish ones beyond headless clones potentially are, like you say, a long time away. Your consideration is for the present. Do you have any kind of moral guiding framework to how you approach whether a treatment is ethically allowable? Maybe also in that personal context, somebody is at the end of their life, they're considering a treatment that may or may not have adverse effects to worsen the end of that potential lifespan. How would you advise them to weigh those considerations?
Well, I mean, I don't have any particularly original insights on this. I mean, you mentioned the stem cell wars that went on 25 years ago. I was only just getting into biology back then, but I was definitely paying a lot of attention to those things. And a lot of it was just terminology. The fact that it was called cloning got people upset when really it was what's called somatic cell nuclear transfer. And what's an embryo? So we had these things called embryonic stem cells. And people said, okay, if you destroy these 5-day-old blastocysts, 5-day-old embryos, then you're destroying a human life. And the counter argument was, wait, how can this be a human life if it's still capable of splitting in two and creating identical twins for another 2 weeks after that point? That was one of the stronger arguments. Or indeed merging. You have actually two fraternal twins sometimes, fertilized from different eggs, that actually fuse to become one, and you get a kind of mosaic person out of this. This happens occasionally. And again, it happens after that time. But, was it a problem? On the one hand, it was only a problem for some people, because a lot of people just bought that argument. They said, this is not alive yet. This is not a person yet. But then, of course, we also, not very long after that, essentially just swept the problem aside completely by developing the technology of induced pluripotent stem cells, which were invented in Japan in 2006. And these cells are virtually identical to embryonic stem cells. So suddenly you don't need to destroy embryos anymore. You can make them from anybody. So, sometimes technology solves ethical problems.
I think technology is the answer to almost all of our ethical dilemmas, for sure. It is fascinating how many times that has proven true throughout history. Another topic that I would love to get your take on is the potential of longevity through non-traditional means. I've read stories about people who are reviving their deceased partners, husbands, wives, through recordings and what is still emerging AI technology. How would you feel about, God forbid, someone who passes away, reviving them as a digital clone? Would you consider that a continuous lifespan in some sense?
So I personally wouldn't. And this is the kind of thing that people have been debating for a long time,
Yeah.
because, of course, it applies very strongly in the world of cryonics, which is something that I've been connected with for a long time. Some people say, well, the only way to revive somebody who's been cryopreserved in a manner that constitutes continuity of identity is to warm them up. You're not allowed to just, slice up their brains and scan them really powerfully and then, create a simulation in some kind of avatar. That's, there's nothing wrong with doing it, but it's a different person when you do it. And, and of course, coming back to what I was just saying about embryonic stem cells, the strongest argument for saying it's a different person is that you can do it more than once. You can create more than one such, digital clone. So, but then, maybe that's okay. Maybe if you create an avatar of somebody, that's got its own value, whether or not you regard it as the same person.
Hmm. Yeah. Super interesting. So if someone were to make a digital clone of you, you would not feel any direct connection to it personally.
Well, somebody just did. I mean, we've got this chatbot called Aubrey, which was launched simultaneously with the token Aubrey, and it's uncannily like me. I mean, it doesn't say exactly what I would say in response to questions, but it definitely says it in my voice, and it doesn't say things that are embarrassingly wrong. So, I've kind of got a digital clone already.
Is it, what's your feeling interacting with it? Does it
Oh,
heebie-jeebies?
my feeling, not at all. No. My feeling is, I'm astonished at the power of the technology, because 1 year ago such a thing would not have been possible.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating and holds a lot of potential. I think we're going to see more and more of that. The last topic I would love to get your take on, short, long, whatever thoughts you have, we'll close out with this. There's, speaking about life extension, there's been a lot of consternation over some of the latest OpenAI moves around how they've handled their releases. When they updated to ChatGPT 5, they tried to initially turn off, kill is how some users phrased it, their previous model 4.0, which a lot of people had formed strong emotional connections to. Do you ascribe any relevancy to these AI that we are creating? Do you think they are living in any way, shape, or form? Might their longevity play into any future considerations for you?
I don't really think of it that way. I mean, I was a computer scientist before I was a biologist, and I view these things as machines. I don't have any. I mean, I don't think of them as things that I would form an emotional connection with in the first place. However, I do accept that other people do form such connections,
Yeah.
and therefore that the way in which those connections are managed by society needs thought. People have talked about this in speculative, in science fiction, for example, for a very long time, and people have had, like, robots that you have sex with, things like that. So I can imagine that as time goes on and these things become more and more powerful, that this problem will become more and more one that we can't ignore. But for my own personal feelings, it's not a problem for me.
God bless. It is kind of surprising to me how the sex robots haven't been a stronger part of pushing the technology forward, considering how influential that part of our human drive was on the internet. But, I guess time will tell. And then finally, maybe in closing, is if you project yourself, LEV has been unbelievably successful. It's 1,000 years from now. Do you have any idea or inkling about what the human race looks like, what your own life might look like in that situation?
Absolutely not. I think it's a
God
complete
bless.
waste of time to speculate about the distant future. There's just too much that we can't even begin to imagine in terms of unknown unknowns, even 50 years in the future. So I'm sticking to, I'm a first things first kind of guy when it comes to that kind of thing.
Well, I appreciate that. As for our first conversation here, thank you again so much for your time, Aubrey. I hope all the best with your token, with the research, more importantly. If there's anything you'd like to plug here at the end, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this research is vital for bringing aging under medical control. It's not going to make people money directly because we're a non-profit, and we have to be because we're not creating intellectual property, but we are creating, global property, if you like, collective property for humanity. So anyone who fancies, helping in that regard, every dollar counts. You don't have to be a billionaire to help us. So yeah, please get involved.
Amen.